This video will cover steps to complete Access Project 5.4. So for this project, we will be working with a database for a worldwide health organization. So to complete the project, we will modify tables to ensure that there is consistent data entry, and this will also help prevent data errors. So we'll be adding a calculated field and total row and creating some other queries to modify some of the tables. So to get started, if you haven't already, you want to go ahead and download and open the start file. And if necessary, you'll need to enable content and go ahead and save the database. So we'll jump right into step 3. And so step 3, we need to open the locations table that lists the organization's locations around the world. And once we have that table open, we'll make the following changes. So to open the table, you want to go ahead and double click it. And by default, the table will open in Datasheet View. So from the Home tab, we can switch the view to Design View. And the first thing it wants us to do is add an input mask to the location ID field to require 3 letters followed by 1 required number and 2 optional numbers. Well, first of all, we need to know a little bit about input masks. So hopefully this is just a refresher, but an input mask can be used to limit the pattern for the entry of data in a database. So for this input mask, we actually want to limit the type of data that can be entered into this location field. So by default, if we go down here to input mask, we actually have the option to use the input mask wizard. And if we pull up the wizard, you can look through here and see that there's several frequently used input masks created for us, but none of these actually apply to what we want to do for the location ID. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this. So that basically means we need to create our own. So one thing also, to create your own, you need to be somewhat familiar with some of the characters that define the input masks. So if you're not familiar with those, or you haven't read the text, and it may take a while to memorize these, you can always go to Access Help and put in input mask characters, or how to define an input mask, or simply input mask. But then there's a list you can review that actually goes over which character you would use and why you would use it. So if we look back at the instructions, it tells us that we want to require 3 letters. So if we look through this list, we find here that L means the user must enter a letter. So we want to require that they enter 3 letters. So the first thing we want to put in on our input mask is 3 L's. Now if we go back over here to our characters, the next part of this question tells us that it's followed by 1 required number. So if we look up here, it says user must enter a digit 0 to 9. So that's what we want to put next then, is 0. Now the last part is that we want to require 2 optional numbers. So if we go back to this list, and we can see that user can enter a digit. So that means they're not required to. So we want to put in 2 9s. Alright, so after we do this, we want to go ahead and put in 2 semicolons, and this is just to signify that a valid data entry is required. And then we want to add the underscore character as a data entry placeholder, and that was in the instructions. So now we have our input mask entered, and I forgot to put the underscore. So for the input mask, you should have LLL099 semicolon semicolon underscore. So that's all we need to do for step A. So if we move on to step B, it wants us to modify the lookup field properties for the location type. So we need to click down here on location type so that when we come down to the field properties, we are editing those for the location type field name. And so we want to limit the entry to values in the lookup list. So since we want to limit the values on the lookup list, we need to click the lookup tab, And here we want to go down to limit to list. So we scroll down here and we see limit to list, and we simply want to change that no to a yes. Okay, so the next step, we want to modify the lookup field properties for the location type. So we still want to be on the location type, and we still want to be on the lookup tab. So this time we want to allow multiple values. So right now we are not allowing multiple values. We want to change that to allow multiple values. Now we are going to get a pop-up that says you have changed the location type lookup column to store multiple values. You will not be able to undo this change once you save the table. Do you want to change the location type to store multiple values? And we want to go ahead and click yes. Alright, so for step D, it wants us to hide the patient average field so that it is hidden in datasheet view. So remember, right now we're in design view, so we want to switch to datasheet view, and it's telling us we need to save the table first, so you can go ahead and click yes. And now that we're in datasheet view, we can simply just click the patient average column, and we can right click and just click hide fields. So it doesn't delete them. If we switch back to design view, we still have our patient average as a field name. We just don't have it visible when we're in the datasheet view. Alright, so that's all we're doing for this table, so you can go ahead and save it. And remember, you have the save tool here on your quick access toolbar, and then we can go ahead and close the table. Alright, so for step 4, it says the shipment table tracks shipments made to the organization's locations around the world. So we want to open the shipments table to make the following changes. So again, to open a table, we simply double click, and then we want to add a calculated field name named lost to the far right side of the shipments table to calculate the number of units for each shipment. So we're going to use an expression. So the first thing we're going to do, if we're going to add a calculated field, we want to go ahead and switch to design view. And to add that field, we simply go into our list of field names, and now we can just type in loss. And then for the data type, it tells us that we want to add a calculated field. So when we click on our list, we can scroll down and find calculated. Now, because this is a calculated field, we get the option to use this expression builder. So if you want to read a little more on entering an expression to calculate the value of a calculated column, you can click on this link and it'll give you some more details. But for this specific question, the instruction tells us the expression to use. So we can just, because these are existing fields in our database, we can go ahead and just start typing quantity, and we actually end up getting a list of options that we could use for this expression. So we want to select quantity shipped, and then our expression in our instructions tells us we want to subtract quantity shipped from quantity received. So now we can start typing in quantity received, and we're able to double click it to select it, and there we have the expression. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And so that's all we need to do for step A. Alright, for step B, we want to display the total row with the sum for both quantity shipped and quantity received fields. So to do that, we want to switch back over to datasheet view. And again, anytime we're switching views, we're probably going to get the pop-up to save the table. So it's a good practice to just get into saving the table frequently. So we want to display the total row. So from the Home tab, we have the option for totals. So if we go ahead and click that totals, that puts the total row here at the bottom of in datasheet view. And it wants us to use sum for both quantity shipped. So if we find our column for quantity shipped and we go down here to our total row, then we have the option to choose from a list of standard functions. So we want to select sum, and then we also want to do that for quantity received. We want to select sum. Okay, so the next thing we want to do on this table is we want to add a validation rule to the quantity shipped field to require the entry to be greater than or equal to 12. So when we're adding validation rules, we want to switch back to design view, and we want to do this in the quantity shipped field. So we click up here on quantity shipped, and then we simply want to go down here to validation rule, and we want to put in our greater than or equal to 12, which is the rule we wanted to enter. And then we also, typically when we put in a rule, we put in validation text to follow. So we want to type in new shipments must contain at least 12 units, a period. Now we can just go ahead and save that table. And you'll get the pop-up that data integrity rules have been changed and existing data may not be valid for the new rules. So on this one, we actually want to go ahead and look back at step D. So on the hint, it says allow data violations in existing data. So rather than try to apply that rule to existing data, we'd want to allow the violations to exist. So we actually want to click no on this one. All right, now we can go ahead and close this table. Okay, so step 5, we want to create an update query to update the comments field for all patients who have not had a flu shot. So now we want to go to our Create tab, and we just want to go to the Query Design tool. And we want to base this query on the diagnosis table. So we can just double click that table, or you can click it to select it and then click Add. Either way, once you have it in the table selected, then you can just go ahead and close this Show Table window. So I'm going to just drag down a little just so I see all the fields. And we do want to add all of the fields for this query. So we can just double click each one and it actually adds them to our query. Okay, so we have, you can just kind of glance through here and make sure you didn't miss one. It's easy to miss when there's a whole list. And then the next thing we want to do is the instruction tells us we want to create an update query. So we have our query started. Now we want to click on, in the query type, we want to click the update tool. Now notice that changed our validation information down here just a little bit. So now we can actually make some designations for our data or add some criteria. So the first piece of criteria we want to add is to the flu shot field. So here I see flu shot, and I'm going to go down here to the criteria row, and I want to type in false. And then the other piece of criteria we want to add is we want to update the comments field. So we have the option to update, so I'm going to go over here to update comments, and now we want to type in call patient to make appointment for flu shot. And we want a period after that. Okay, so once we have this criteria added to our query, now we want to run that query. And we get this pop-up that says you're about to update 211 rows, and which is 211 records. So our instruction tells us that we should have 211 record updates, so that's what we want. So I'm going to click yes. And now we're ready to go ahead and save this query. So I'm just going to my Save tool, and I'm going to name this query Update Flu Shot Comments. And so once we have that query named, I'll go ahead and click OK, and then we can close it. All right, so step 6, we want to create another query. And so this query we want to base on the diagnosis table. So again, we want to go to the Create tab and our query design. And for this one, we want to add all records for patients with a negative diagnosis to a new table. So from the diagnosis table, so we have the diagnosis table selected here in our Show Table list. So I'm going to click Add, and then I'm going to close this window. And again, I'm going to expand that list so that I can see all the fields. So on this one, we just want to include 4 fields, which is diagnosis ID, patient ID, and remember, I'm just double clicking them to select them, flu shot, and diagnosis. Okay, so it wants us to use the criteria negative for the diagnosis field. So I want to come down here to diagnosis, and in criteria we want to type in negative, and then we actually want to make this a table. So now that I have my criteria in here, we want to go up here to our query type tools, and we want to click make table. And we want to call this table results negative. And we want to notice we have a couple of options down here. We can either leave it in our current database, or we can import it to another database. We actually want to leave it in our current database. So we can go ahead and click OK. And then we want to run the query. So now we've created the table, we want to run this query. And it tells us that we are going to paste 65 rows into the new table, and our instruction tells us that we should have 65 records. So we want to say yes. Now notice we have a new table over here, results negative, and then we also have our query that we created. So we want to save this query. So we want to go to our tool, our save tool, and we want to name this query make table results negative. And we want to click OK. Alright, so step 7, we want to create a delete query this time. And so this query will delete all records for patients with negative diagnosis from the diagnosis table. So essentially this is, anyone that does not have the flu doesn't really need to be on the flu table. So again, to create the query, we want to go to our Create tab, and we want to click on, we also want to close the Make Table Results Negative query. So now we can create our new query. And this one we want to base it on the diagnosis table. So I'm going to click Add and Close, and we want to use, we want to add all fields from the diagnosis table. So again, I'm going to expand that list so I can see everything, and I'm just going to select each one. Okay, and now we want to use the criteria negative for the diagnosis field. So again, we're going to go down here to negative, or to diagnosis, and in criteria we want to type negative. And then we want to click on delete. On the query type, we want to click on delete. So now when we run the query, we should get a pop-up that the query should delete 65 records, and this is what it's telling us. You are about to delete 65 rows from the specified table. So we can go ahead and click yes. And now we want to save this query as, so I'm going to go to my Save tool, and we want to save it as delete negative results, records, and click OK. And we can go ahead and close this query. All right, so step 8, we want to create a query to summarize the number of patients for each diagnosis state. So again, we want to go to our Create tab. We want to click on Query Design. And this time we want to select the Patients table. So I'm going to click Patients, and I'm going to click Add. I'm going to go ahead and close this. So from the Patients table, we want to add the state field. So I'm going to click State field. But then it goes on and says from the diagnosis table, we want to add the diagnosis flu shot fields. So notice that I no longer have my show table list. So if we want to add another table to a query, we can go up here on the Query Tools Design tab, and we can click on Show Table. So now we have our Show Table, which has our list of tables listed again. So now we can select the diagnosis table. So I'm going to add that now and close it. And just notice that, you know, in previous classes, you should have become familiar with how data relates between tables. So for these two tables, the patient ID is what's relating the data here. So on the diagnosis table, we want to add the diagnosis and flu shot, not the diagnosis ID. We want to do the diagnosis field, and then we want to add the flu shot field. So on this query, we want to display the total row. So here on the Query Tools Design tab, we have the option to include a totals row. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And notice that down here now we have the option for total. So under, and then under the flu shot field, we want to select count. So we have flu shot, and we can total, if we click in the total cell, we can use the list, and we can select count. And now when we run the query, so we come up here to run, we should have 15 records in the result. And if we look down here in the taskbar, we can see that we do have 15 records. So we want to go ahead and save this query, and we want to call this one Flu Shots by State. And then we can go ahead and click OK. And we can close this query. All right, so we're going to do a modification in, we're going to modify a query. So it's the under 18 query. So we can go ahead and double click it to select it. And so we want to modify it in the SQL view. So typically, you know, you probably will never work in this SQL view, or you know, unless you're really doing some advanced stuff. But for this step, we're in SQL view, and it wants us to modify the code to display only records for patients under 18, and it wants us to use this code. So we want to add the text patients under 18, and typically when you're working in code, the last line of code is kind of the line that designates what the output or what the final product will be. So if we're adding something to it, we want to make sure we add it before this last line. So I'm going to put my insertion point after patient ID in the second row, and I'm going to hit the Enter key, and now I'm going to add this line of code, and I want to add it exactly as it is in the instructions. So essentially, this code we're adding is, you know, we're wanting it to display records for patients that are under the age of 18. So now that we've added that code, now we can click Run, the Run tool for our query, and it tells us that we should have pulled 18 records. And again, if we look down here on our taskbar, we can see that we have 18 records. So we can go ahead and save this query, and remember this was an existing query, so we don't have to name it. It was already named, so we can go ahead and close it. And that's it. That's the last step for this project. So you can go ahead and save it and submit it. And if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call or send me an email.